Madam Web is now available to stream on Netflix, and this has been one of the most talked about movies of 2024. Definitely one of the most parodied and one of the most made fun of movies of 2024 thus far. And it's also a movie that wasn't particularly widely seen upon its release in February. This was a pretty big underperformance from Sony. And now it's out on Netflix. Audiences are actually getting the chance to see it. It's been doing pretty well on Netflix thus far for its week release. I got the chance to see this movie this week. I didn't see it in theaters. And I had 3 questions that I wanted to ask about Madam Web. And I want to say this ties even more into Sony and Spider-Man in general, because The Amazing Spider-Man 2 just had its re-release in theaters last week, which I wanted to just talk about this whole idea of Sony and the state of Spider-Man right now. The 3 questions I had going in to watching Madam Web, the first question being, were we, the critics, too harsh on Madam Web? The second one, who is asking for the Sony villain cinematic universe? And the third question being, what now? Now that Madam Web has underperformed and we have 2 more of these Sony villain cinematic universes, what are we to expect? And what should Sony expect in this next year? Those are the 3 questions that I wanted to focus on now. And with that all said, let's talk about Madam Web now. You know all the memes, you know the general story of this, but this follows this woman who becomes Madam Web, and she has to protect these 3 young teenage girls who are being chased by this Spider-Man villain type so that they don't kill him in the future. Madam Web has the ability to basically see in the future. And watching this movie on Netflix, I was kind of taken aback by obviously all the harsh reviews of this movie. And while watching this movie, I will have to fully admit, I never had the reaction of this movie is downright terrible. While watching it, I will have to fully admit, I was fairly engaged with this movie. Not engaged on the sense that I thought ever that this was a good movie, but for a little bit of that junk feeling to it, I was having fun for it. It was one of those movies that I was actually finding so bad that I was audibly having fun with it, or thinking it was so over the top ridiculous that this was kind of the nostalgic superhero movie that I grew up on. It reminded me of Daredevil. It reminded me of the first Fantastic Four movie from 2005, Elektra, some of those early X-Men films even. Like, there was something so haphazard about Madam Web that I couldn't help myself but finding nostalgia in it. So when we say that this movie is bad, and let me make this point very clear, because Madam Web is very bad. We are talking about a bad movie, but that doesn't quantify necessarily as how we've been describing bad superhero movies recently. I don't think this movie is overly CGI'd like some of the MCU installments of recent note. That not to say that the CGI is good in this movie. I don't think this film suffers from over plotting. I think it's a fairly straightforward movie when it comes down to it. It doesn't have too many characters and is trying to do too much setup for future stuff. It doesn't have those issues that a lot of modern superhero movies have. What we're talking more about with Madam Web, when I say specifically that this movie has really bad elements in it, it has really wooden actors in this movie. I love Dakota Johnson, and she doesn't know what she's doing in this film. And I don't know if there's any real direction to this character. Sydney Sweeney, who is another actress I like, is just downright bad in this movie as well. She is delivering lines that are so wildly out of tune or tone with the rest of the movie that it doesn't really make any sense. So you have these performances that don't work. You have a villain that makes no sense and is just so poorly conceived, and the plot itself around him basically believing that these 3 girls will kill him, so he seeks them out to kill them first. It doesn't hold up to any form of logic. But like I said, once you're in on the actual movie and that's what you're watching, I thought this movie was fairly excusable and not as horribly bad as some of these other experiences. I saw Morbius in theaters, and I will full on say that I do believe Morbius is a far worse movie than this. This movie at least has a tightness in its, I don't want to call it pacing because this movie is poorly paced, but it has a tightness in what it is trying to do. And that's not to say that what it is trying to do succeeds in this movie, but it is saying that in Madam Web, I found myself at the very least more captivated by what was going on the screen. And maybe this is the effect of it's so bad, it's good, but at least there was an almost inherent like level of just like the filmmakers being like, okay, we can't really solve this movie. This movie's not going to be good. So let's just kind of go for it and just kind of have a little bit of fun and try to infuse something into this movie to give it any form of style and seriousness to it. This is not an overly serious film. I believe other films, specifically like I just referenced Morbius, is incredibly overly serious. This one has a little bit of an airiness to its dialogue, to its jokes in this movie, and that made it more engaging to watch. And I had this feeling the whole time even with Dakota Johnson being so bad in this film, even with Sweeney being so bad in this film, with the stupid overt references that they make to Spider-Man. At one point, Uncle Ben is in this movie played by Adam Scott. And at one point, Dakota Johnson says, I believe it's Dakota Johnson says in the movie, he's going to love being an uncle. None of the responsibilities, all the fun, something like that. And it's a very clear parody of with great power comes great responsibility. And there's a few of those throughout this movie. That's at least like the level of overt obviousness that they're trying to hit in this movie. And I found it just so perplexing in this movie that I kind of had fun with it. Where Morbius, I just don't think there's anything fun, and I don't think anything besides Matt Smith in that film works. This one, I'm like, okay, I laughed because of how bad that was. And I had fun with it. So I was willing to engage with it more on that level. Madam Web, not a good movie. So that brings me to my second point, is who is asking for the Sony villain cinematic universe? And I think that's probably the larger issue with this Madam Web movie or the Venom movies or Morbius, is no one's really asking for these movies. I don't think anyone is so deeply invested in the Sony villain cinematic universe. And that's not to say that there can't be fun in these movies. I find the Venom movies to be a bit of a guilty pleasure. I think there is a lot of fun that Tom Hardy brings to that character of Venom. So that it's not to say that these movies can just be all bad. But while watching this movie, I didn't understand, if not an end goal, I didn't understand the point of it. Where I watched this movie and I was like, are you trying to want to introduce characters? Because that's what it feels like. Because you have Sweeney, you have, I believe, Isabela Merced is her name. You have all these young actresses in here who are obviously going to grow up to be Spider-Women in a future installment if this film had been successful. So it does feel like you're setting up for sequels. But again, you don't have Spider-Man in any of these movies, which is a weird thing. So you're setting up all of the Spider-Man villains without Spider-Man being the central villain in any of these. So is it an idea of you're hoping one day you'll be able to get all these characters together and fight Spider-Man? If that's the case, then I guess that's why you're investing in this. But so right now at this moment, we don't have Spider-Man. We don't have really anything connecting them. So what's the point of these movies? And is it to be a little bit of a throwback to the early 2000s comic book movies that made, Marvel basically at its beginning, its origins? And if that's the case, then the tone just kind of seems to be off. Like these movies should be a little bit more silly and ridiculous. Like I said, I think Venom works so well in moments because it is just almost overtly going for ridiculousness and cheesiness. With Madam Web, I think it's kind of stuck in this middle zone of being not as serious as a film like Morbius, but being more serious than a film like Venom. And that's where I find the issues with these movies are specifically. It's just there's no blueprint to them. And again, you don't need a blueprint. You don't need this cinematic universe to understand or make a singular movie. But it feels like they're trying to make it a cinematic universe, and they're making decisions within the movies and choosing certain characters to bring it into a cinematic universe. But there is no plan for a cinematic universe. So essentially, you're trying to do something. You're trying to make a cinematic universe, but you don't have the resources to do it. And thus, you're making solo films, but it's not a solo film because your intent is to make a cinematic universe. But it can't be a cinematic universe, thus it has to be a solo movie because you don't have the central character in Spider-Man. So what are you doing? And I think that's one of the largest problems with Sony's direction with the cinematic universe that they're trying to establish. It's kind of either one or. And if you just kind of want to have all these movies and all the villains are interacting, that's one thing. And at least that gives a level of cohesiveness to what they're trying to basically make an archetype of. But again, it's just all these issues kind of coming into play within Madam Web. And I think Madam Web represents everything that everyone had issues with this Sony experiment. And again, that's not to say, I think Morbius is far worse than it, but I think that's why people just started really feeling fed up with it. And I don't know if this decision is to bring back an Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, reinstall something. It does feel like Madam Web is supposed to be in the same universe as Andrew Garfield Spider-Man. And I know the timelines don't work out because I believe Madam Web is weirdly a period piece set in 2004. I guess I don't actually know. Maybe it's texting isn't really a thing, but it does almost feel like these characters are supposed to be more in line with an Andrew Garfield. I mean, Dakota Johnson and Andrew Garfield are quite literally peers who appeared together in The Social Network, but it does feel more in line with that movie. But again, they're not making the choices. It's either they're 5 steps ahead without actually establishing the audience's trust in one movie. And this brings me back to The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which is a movie I defend and also think has some huge issues with it. The biggest issue in that movie being the fact that they set up way too much with Spider-Man's parents in that movie. They're really trying to bring this mystery of these movies together in Amazing Spider-Man 1 and Amazing Spider-Man 2. And you don't care about the villains at all. The central part of the movie that works the best is Gwen and Peter. Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone work really well in those movies, and that's the dynamic that you want to see those movies for. And I think there's really good Spider-Man direction, especially in how New York is characterized in those movies. But everything else doesn't really fully work. So it's, again, now this question of, does this movie deserve to be reclaimed? And does Madam Web deserve to be reclaimed? The answer is not really. Like, these movies aren't very good. There isn't like something that we were missing the first time around, but there is something inherently a little bit fun and cheesier, especially if you want a movie to just have on in the background. I think Madam Web is far easier to understand than something, say, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. I think this movie is far more linearly paced in its understanding that you're going to get the better gist of it and you'll feel like you'll watch the movie and understand it. Where if you're just kind of watching Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania in the background, you're going to be really confused. But now we get down to the final question of what now? Madam Web doesn't work. Morbius didn't work. And now they have 2 more of these movies coming out. They have Kraven the Hunter coming out later this year, and they have Venom: The Last Dance, a really funny title for Venom. But what are we going to do now? Like, what is this end goal? And maybe the end goal is nothing. Like, maybe it's just like, okay, Venom, we've had success. Maybe let's do one more and see if we can get just anything more out of this franchise. And Kraven the Hunter, it's probably going to be more of the same. And that's the bleakness that I think some critics are picking up when we talk about Madam Web. And again, I say we. I know some people are going to have issues. I do write film criticism, and I do write it for a magazine, but I also understand that I don't speak for most, if not all, critics in any way. So I don't want to really associate myself and say that I can speak for them. But the sense that I get, the larger panic that I feel within film criticism right now is that Madam Web should just be able to exist as a movie tied to the Spider-Man thing and kind of be its own thing and kind of be its own silly, stupid adventure, if you will. But Sony is making the stakes out to be far greater. They're spending far more on these movies. They need these films to be successful. And when these films are not successful, it's not bringing in a new age of essentially Sony choosing other properties or other ideas or original screenplays or anything like that to develop and really try to make something new and glorious out of it. Instead, Sony is kind of treating the cinematic universe of the Marvel villains, or the Spider-Man's villains specifically, as kind of a sunken cost, where if it doesn't work, well, you got to keep pouring out money towards it, because Spider-Man we have tied up with the MCU rights. We have the animated movies that are doing really well for us, but we kind of need our own cinematic universe, our own cinematic property, something that we can believe to be a cash cow for the next 5 years and solidly release 1 to 2 movies a year and make a really healthy profit out. That is the doom and gloom that I think people are feeling with these movies, where it's just like, this is the end product that doesn't mean anything. And if you wanted to do something with this and try to build out something more exciting and more fun, then give it into more capable hands, really try developing something out of it, maybe lower these budgets and make it far less doom and gloom when these movies come out and flop and really hurt your studio. That is my sense of this all. So with that said, that's my brief Madam Web review and kind of a context of where I think we are right now within the 2024 superhero industry, as it does not relate to the MCU or DC, kind of this third thing that obviously has relationships to the MCU, but is not the MCU. That's where I think we are. Madam Web, check it out on Netflix if you want to. There's no reason to really check it out, but I also think people may have check this movie out with friends and make fun of it really on the background, or just have it on. I think that's where the enjoyment of this movie can be had. On a scale of 5 stars, I'm going pretty low on this. I would say it's not. I gave Morbius 1 star. Madam Web is better than that. I'm going at 1.5 stars for Madam Web. Thank you all for watching. And if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more reviews and videos.